Michael Harper had never thought of himself as someone who would inherit a piece of land, let alone a secluded cabin hidden deep in the pines at the edge of a lake. He was an architect by trade, a man used to working on glass towers, sprawling residential complexes, and city-funded restorations of historical facades, always answering to committees and deadlines, and never quite creating something that felt his own. When his uncle passed away the previous year and left him this remote property, a weathered wooden cabin built in the 1940s by hand and patched together over decades of use, Michael assumed it would remain a kind of sentimental keepsake. See, weekend place to visit a few times a year before inevitably selling it to some vacation home buyer. Yet, the moment he unlocked the creaking front door and stepped inside, smelling the mix of cedar, dust, and faint smoke that still lingered from fires his uncle had lit in the stone hearth, he felt something take root. The place was rough and imperfect, the walls uneven, the plumbing primitive, but it pulsed with a kind of quiet dignity that made him want to stay, to restore it not into something fashionable or profitable, but into a space where he could breathe and think without the city pressing against his shoulders. He began spending more weekends there, bringing sketches, notebooks, and eventually even a drafting board that he propped up against the old windows overlooking the water. The cabin quickly stopped being a relic of his uncle's eccentric independence and became a workshop of sorts for Michael's mind, a retreat where he could take off the jacket and tie, wear the same worn jeans 3 days in a row, and let ideas stretch, without a clock ticking. Every trip reinforced the sense that this wasn't just another piece of property, but a place that belonged to him in a way no condominium or carefully designed townhouse ever had. He painted the porch, repaired the roof tiles with his own hands, and kept telling himself he was only preserving it until he figured out what to do. In truth, he already knew. He didn't want to let it go. It was the only thing he had that wasn't compromised by professional obligations or endless negotiations with clients who thought more about resale value than design. The surrounding neighborhood was unusual. Technically, it was part of a broader lakeside community that had formed an HOA decades ago, but the cabin had been excluded at the time, since the land it sat on predated the development and had been acquired, under a different deed. Michael learned this from his uncle's yellowed papers, the kind written on typewriters and notarized with fading stamps. The HOA had tried over the years to bring his uncle under their umbrella, but he had resisted successfully, claiming his independence and refusing to pay for services he never used. As far as Michael knew, the property was still exempt, which suited him perfectly because the last thing he wanted was someone telling him what color he could paint the door, or how many logs should be stacked neatly on the porch. He liked the small signs of disorder, the mismatched shingles, the scratch his uncle had left on the kitchen table, the lopsided gate that opened onto a trail leading into the woods. In the evenings, when the lake turned silver and frogs began croaking in the reeds, Michael sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and tried to imagine what his uncle had thought about during those solitary years. There was a deep calm in that kind of life, one without neighbors peering over fences or board meetings where people argued about landscaping regulations. It was as if time moved differently at the cabin, slower, with more weight, and it gave Michael a kind of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. He told himself he would keep it, not as an investment, not as a vacation rental, but as his own boundary against the world. The cabin represented something he hadn't had in years: control, privacy, and the quiet dignity of belonging to a place that answered to no one. The first sign that something was wrong came on a late Saturday afternoon, when Michael returned from a supply run to the nearest town, carrying a box of nails, a roll of copper wire, and a loaf of bread from the local bakery. As he turned onto the gravel path that led from the main road to his cabin, he saw a new object fixed firmly into the ground near the edge of the driveway. At first glance, it looked like a rustic marker, the sort of decorative sign one might see outside a bed and breakfast, with neat lettering burned into the wood and sealed under varnish. When he drew closer, however, the words struck him with a jolt. Harper Guest Lodge, certified by Lakeside Homeowners Association. His own name, carved into something he had never ordered, accompanied by the official crest of the HOA, stood, gleaming in the low sun. For a few seconds he simply stood there, stunned, wondering if it was some kind of misguided gesture by neighbors to welcome him. But the longer he looked, the more it felt like a violation, as though someone had quietly renamed his home while he was away. Carrying his supplies inside, Michael tried to dismiss the incident as a mistake. Perhaps the HOA had intended the sign for some other property, and it had been placed incorrectly, though the likelihood of another Harper in the area seemed slim. He leaned the sign against the porch railing and made a mental note to call their office on Monday, irritated but not alarmed. Yet, when evening came, his phone buzzed with a message from a colleague who had seen a post online advertising a guest lodge available for short-term stays on the very lake where Michael's cabin stood. The listing included photos unmistakably taken of his porch and his dock, clearly shot without his knowledge, with captions describing the location as a community-managed lodging for distinguished visitors. The message ended with a joking note from his colleague. "Didn't know you went into hospitality, Mike." That night, sleep did not come easily. He tossed and turned, replaying the images in his mind, anger building with each thought of strangers wandering around his property while he was absent. By morning, he decided to confront the issue directly. Driving to the small strip mall where the HOA maintained their office, he walked into the glass-fronted building with its potted plants and stacks of newsletters. Behind the reception desk sat a woman with clipped speech and a name tag that read, "Margaret Haynes, Community Relations." Michael explained calmly that he had discovered a sign labeling his cabin as a guest lodge and had seen an online listing using photos of his property. He wanted clarification. Margaret listened with a neutral expression, then flipped through a binder on her desk. After a few moments, she looked up and announced, as if reciting policy, that according to the HOA's revised charter, the cabin had been designated as a guest facility to support community tourism initiatives. Michael stared at her, incredulous. "This is my private home," he said slowly. "It has never been part of your HOA. My uncle opted out decades ago. I have the deed and every paper to prove it." Margaret's expression did not change. She replied that, while the property might once have been exempt, recent updates to the association's jurisdiction extended to all parcels within a certain boundary, and the cabin was now included. He protested, demanding to know how they could make such a claim without his consent. Her answer was delivered with professional detachment. The decision was approved during a community vote last spring. Notices were sent. If you wish to dispute the designation, you may submit a petition in writing, but please understand the board's decision stands until reviewed. She then excused herself, as if the matter were already closed. The drive back felt surreal. Michael gripped the steering wheel, replaying her words. A petition? A vote he had never been informed of? The audacity of casually converting someone's home into what amounted to a rental property under HOA oversight left him seething. When he arrived at the cabin, his anger deepened. Two men in polo shirts bearing the HOA crest were unloading a box at his doorstep. Inside were brochures, glossy papers with staged photographs of his cabin, and cheerful slogans about authentic lakeside experiences. He demanded to know what they were doing. One man shrugged and said they were preparing promotional materials for an upcoming visit by a special guest. They left the box and walked back to their truck without answering further questions. Michael opened the brochures in disbelief. His cabin had been fully appropriated in language, described as a rustic retreat owned and managed by the community, with amenities listed that did not exist: concierge service, complimentary breakfast, and private guided tours. He felt as though his life had been rewritten on paper, his reality replaced by a fabricated version that served someone else's agenda. The final page of the brochure chilled him most. It announced proudly that the Harper Guest Lodge would soon host the Honorable Mayor Eldridge and his family, for a weekend stay. A cold, sick dread crept over him. The mayor. The implication was unmistakable. This was not merely a clerical error or a misguided publicity campaign. His home was being leveraged as a tool of influence, a way for the HOA to curry favor with political figures by offering a free, picturesque retreat at someone else's expense. He tried to imagine strangers, the mayor's children running through his uncle's old kitchen, the mayor's wife sleeping in the bedroom where family photographs still hung on the walls, and the thought twisted his stomach. It was not just trespass, it was theft of identity, an erasure of his right to decide who entered his own door. That evening, Michael sat at the worn table, the brochures spread before him like evidence of a crime. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and the lake shimmered in the fading light, calm and indifferent to the turmoil in his chest. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That his HOA had renamed his house and advertised it to the mayor? It sounded absurd even to him. Yet the absurdity was real, printed in glossy ink. He realized with a sinking weight that he stood at the beginning of a conflict he had not chosen, one in which the very ground he called his own was being pulled from beneath him under the guise of community service and bylaws he had never agreed to. Michael did not sleep much after discovering the brochures, and when dawn broke over the lake with its muted gray light filtering through the curtains of the cabin, he already felt the weight of dread in his chest. He brewed coffee mechanically, staring at the glossy pages he had left on the table the night before, the photographs of his cabin printed without his permission, the bold caption welcoming guests to a retreat that was not and had never been a public space. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the HOA had no intention of backing down. Their men had walked onto his porch as if they owned the place, and their office had treated his outrage as nothing more than an inconvenience. He knew that if he did nothing, by the time the mayor and his family arrived, it would be too late to stop them from turning his uncle's home into a prop for their politics. By mid-morning, Michael drove back to town and filed into the county clerk's office with a stack of documents he had hastily gathered from his uncle's filing cabinet. The original deed, the notarized letter from decades ago that confirmed his uncle had opted out of the HOA, and property tax records that never mentioned any association dues. The clerk on duty, a man in his 50s with a distracted manner, glanced over the papers but shrugged, explaining that while the documents looked valid, if the HOA had filed revised bylaws with the county, the cabin might have been swept under their jurisdiction by default. Michael pressed him, asking whether such retroactive application was even legal, and the clerk admitted it was a gray area often contested in court. The phrase lingered with him, a gray area, which in practice meant that the HOA could act boldly and leave it to the homeowner to spend months fighting in litigation. Returning to the cabin, he found another sign had been posted at the end of his driveway, this time larger, with laminated sheets stapled to a wooden frame, declaring that the property was scheduled to host a community cultural exchange. He ripped it down in frustration and carried it back to the porch, where he threw it into the growing pile of brochures and notices. Not long after, a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the gravel, and a woman in a navy suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. She introduced herself curtly as Judy Haynes, the HOA's property manager, and informed him that he was in violation of several community codes for removing official signage. Michael almost laughed at the absurdity, but her flat tone made clear she was not joking. She insisted that the board had authority to enforce compliance and warned that fines would accrue if he continued to interfere. He tried to argue, showing her the deed and the opt-out agreement, but she barely glanced at the papers, dismissing them as outdated and irrelevant under the new charter. When he demanded to see the vote or the notification she claimed had been sent, she responded vaguely, saying the records were internal and that homeowners had been given ample opportunity to review them. It was then that Michael realized they were not just careless but deliberately constructing a version of reality where his ownership meant nothing. They were counting on him being isolated, without the money or influence to challenge them effectively. That night, unsettled and angry, he checked the cabin carefully before locking up. On the porch, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken: faint scuff marks on the doorframe as if someone had tested a key or tool against the lock. He had not seen them earlier, and the implication was obvious. Someone had tried to enter. He sat by the fireplace until late, listening for sounds outside, wondering if they had already copied a key, wondering if his privacy was evaporating piece by piece. The following day, he received a letter delivered not by mail, but by hand, slipped under his door while he had been chopping firewood. It bore the HOA letterhead and stated in formal language that the Harper cabin had been successfully integrated into the community's hospitality program, and that failure to comply with scheduled hosting obligations would be treated as a breach of community trust. The words chilled him. Breach of community trust, as if his refusal to allow strangers into his home made him a traitor to some collective he had never joined. Enclosed was an itinerary printed in neat columns, listing the arrival of the mayor's family, meal times, and even a suggested evening gathering by the fire pit. Every line made Michael's stomach turn. It was as though they had erased him from his own home and replaced him with a role he had never auditioned for. Determined not to remain passive, Michael drove to the town library and spent hours combing through property records on the public terminals. He eventually found an amendment filed by the HOA just 6 months earlier, expanding their jurisdiction by redrawing boundary maps. The adjustment pushed their coverage line directly over his parcel of land, effectively annexing it without consultation. At the bottom of the scanned document was a signature that made him pause. Eam. Harper. His own last name, written in shaky penmanship, claimed to represent his approval as property owner. He stared at it, stunned, because he had never seen this document before, let alone signed it. The realization sank in like a stone. They had not simply bent rules, they had forged his consent. The discovery fueled his anger, but also his fear. Forgery meant they were willing to cross legal lines, confident that he lacked the power to hold them accountable. When he confronted Judy Haynes again, showing her a printout of the document, she smirked slightly and said, "Perhaps you forgot signing it at a community meeting. We have records." The calm certainty in her voice unsettled him more than if she had denied everything outright, because it suggested a broader scheme, one where manufactured paperwork and collective silence could drown out his protests. As he walked back toward the cabin that evening, the forest quiet around him, Michael felt the first stirrings of a larger realization. This was no longer a dispute over signage or brochures. It was an attack on the very idea of his ownership, a calculated campaign to absorb his home into a system that valued influence and appearances over truth. The cabin, once a refuge, had become contested ground, and he understood that unless he found a way to fight, the walls around him would soon echo with voices that were not his own. The days that followed blurred into a haze of paperwork, unanswered calls, and mounting tension that clung to Michael like a second skin. Every morning, he half expected to find another sign planted in the driveway, another letter slid beneath the door, another reminder that his control was slipping, and every evening he walked the perimeter of the cabin with a flashlight, scanning the tree line for intruders he could not see. What disturbed him most was not the overt pressure of the brochures or the itinerary, but the insidious way in which the HOA rewrote reality, transforming his refusal to cooperate into evidence of his supposed hostility, turning his silence into implied consent, and replacing his ownership with the language of community obligation. The isolation pressed harder each day, and though he spoke with colleagues in the city and even considered confiding in an old friend, he always stopped short, ashamed of how surreal the story sounded when spoken aloud. On a damp Tuesday afternoon, rain dripping steadily from the pines, Michael drove once again to the county records office, determined to trace the forged signature on the boundary amendment to its source. The clerk this time was a younger man, more attentive, who pulled the file and showed him the scanned document. Alongside the signature line, in faint pencil that had not been properly erased before scanning, Michael noticed a note. Verified by board. See meeting minutes. That detail was enough to push him toward the HOA archives, where he demanded access to the official minutes of the supposed vote. After 2 hours of waiting in a bland conference room, a staff member finally placed a folder before him. As he flipped through the typed pages, his frustration deepened. The minutes described a community gathering at which several properties had been reclassified, including his own, with a motion passed unanimously. Under attendees, his name appeared alongside dozens of others. There was even a note about his verbal confirmation to support the expansion. Michael sat frozen, staring at the sheet as the room seemed to tilt. It was not merely that his signature had been forged. His presence itself had been fabricated, his voice invented, his consent fictionalized. The HOA had constructed an entire event where he had supposedly spoken in favor of surrendering his independence. The audacity was breathtaking, and the precision terrifying, because it meant that if challenged, they could waive not just a signature but a whole record of communal memory against him. He realized then that the fight was not just about property but about erasure, about being overwritten in the ledger of history by those with more patience and more control of the narrative. That night, back at the cabin, he pored over the forged minutes again, searching for flaws, and one line caught his attention. It mentioned a witness, a man named Leonard Price, who had confirmed Mr. Harper's attendance. The name triggered a faint memory. Leonard was a longtime resident, a retired postal worker who lived 2 roads over and occasionally fished by the lake. Michael had seen him once or twice in passing, a stooped figure with a weathered face, the kind of neighbor who nodded politely but rarely lingered. If Leonard's name was being used as corroboration, perhaps he had been pressured, or perhaps his words had been twisted. Determined to know, Michael set out the next morning to visit him. Leonard greeted him cautiously, standing in the doorway of a modest house that smelled faintly of tobacco. When Michael explained why he had come, the older man hesitated, then invited him in. Over cups of weak coffee, Leonard admitted that he had been at the HOA meeting in question, but did not recall seeing Michael there. He remembered instead that Judy Haynes had read from a list, declaring that certain absent members had already agreed, through prior communication. Leonard had not questioned it at the time, weary of the long proceedings and eager to leave, but now, hearing Michael's confusion, he frowned. "They put your name on the list before anyone could object," he said quietly. "I should have spoken up, but they made it sound official. You weren't the only one either. A couple of folks who've moved away were listed as attending. Nobody wanted to argue with Judy." The confession left Michael both relieved and shaken. Here was proof, however informal, that the minutes were not merely inaccurate but deliberately falsified, and that the HOA had relied on collective apathy to pass their scheme. Yet it also underscored how alone he was, because even Leonard, sympathetic now, admitted he did not want to be dragged into a fight. "They can make life hard for people," he said, glancing at his yard nervously. "Fines, inspections, complaints. Suddenly you can't breathe without them breathing down your neck. I'm sorry, son, but I can't put myself in their crosshairs." Michael left with gratitude for the honesty but a gnawing sense of despair. The truth existed, but lived in whispers no one wanted to speak aloud. That evening, as he drove back along the winding road to his cabin, he passed a van parked at the edge of the woods. Its sides were unmarked, but through the windshield he caught a glimpse of stacked boxes bearing the same HOA crest he had come to dread. Inside were supplies, linens, bottled water, catering trays, as if for a planned event. His anger flared. realizing that preparations for the mayor's visit were already underway, regardless of his protests. He pulled over and approached the driver, a young man in a delivery uniform who shrugged when confronted. "I just bring what they tell me," he muttered. "They said it's for the lodge." Michael demanded to know who gave the order, but the driver shook his head, clearly uninterested in conflict, and drove away, leaving Michael standing in the drizzle with the bitter taste of futility in his mouth. Back at the cabin, he found that someone had left a set of branded towels neatly folded on his porch, embroidered with the initials LHA for Lakeside Home Owners Association. The invasion was no longer subtle but theatrical, each act reinforcing the narrative that his home was no longer his own. He gathered the towels, the brochures, the itineraries, and stuffed them into a trash bag. But the gesture felt hollow, like sweeping back a tide with a broom. For the first time since inheriting the cabin, he wondered if he could actually hold on to it, if the legal machinery aligned against him was too vast to resist. Yet even as despair pressed in, another part of him hardened. His uncle had fought these battles for decades and never surrendered. If Michael let the cabin slip away, he would not only lose a home, but betray the principle of standing ground when the world tried to redraw your lines. Late into the night, he sat by the fire drafting a letter of intent to challenge the HOA's jurisdiction formally. He cited the original deed, the opt-out agreement, and the forged minutes, attaching photographs of the documents. His plan was to deliver it directly to the county inspector, bypassing the HOA entirely. As he wrote, a kind of clarity settled over him. The midpoint of his struggle was not simply recognizing that the HOA wanted his cabin, but understanding that they were willing to fabricate entire histories to claim it, and that his resistance could not be casual or polite. It had to be relentless, precise, and public enough that erasure would be impossible. When he finally set down his pen, the rain had stopped, and the lake reflected the pale moon like a sheet of glass. The cabin seemed to breathe around him, the walls holding his resolve. He knew now that he was not just defending property but fighting for the right to exist in the record, to ensure his voice was not stolen and replaced with someone else's. The realization was both terrifying and liberating, and it marked the true center of the conflict. From this point forward, Michael was no longer reacting to incursions but preparing to counterattack, whatever the cost. Michael's letter of intent did not remain unanswered for long. Only 3 days after he delivered the neatly bound folder to the county inspector's office, he returned to the cabin to find a new notice nailed directly to his porch post, the paper sealed in a plastic sleeve against the weather and bearing the same heavy HOA crest that had begun to feel like a brand burned into his life. This one was different from the glossy brochures and the itineraries, stripped of cheer and printed in stark black type. It accused him of obstructing community operations, of destroying official signage, of refusing to comply with hospitality standards, and warned that continued violations would result in fines escalating daily. At the bottom, in neat legal phrasing, was a threat that chilled him. Failure to resolve these violations will authorize the board to pursue immediate legal remedies, including but not limited to foreclosure proceedings. For a moment, Michael could not breathe, staring at the words as though they might vanish if he blinked, but they remained fixed, undeniable. The letter was a weapon, and it struck him with more force than the forged minutes or the staged brochures. It was no longer about appearances or reputation, but about dismantling his ownership through technicalities, using the machinery of law against him. He called the inspector's office in a fury, demanding to know if his complaint had been received, and was told curtly that it was under review and that in the meantime he should continue to cooperate with the HOA. The indifference in the clerk's tone stung almost as much as the notice itself, as though he were a nuisance rather than a citizen defending his rights. It became clear to him that the HOA operated with confidence precisely because they knew how slowly official channels moved. By the time his grievance wound its way through bureaucratic review, The mayor's visit would already have taken place, and the precedent would be set. That evening, he walked through the cabin, each creak of the wooden floor reminding him that he was being squeezed toward a corner. In the kitchen, he found another subtle violation. A paper inventory sheet left on the counter, listing items on site such as blankets, cookware, and firewood. The sheet had not been there that morning, which meant someone had entered while he was away, moving through the rooms as if taking stock of a property they already considered theirs. The violation made his hands tremble with rage. He changed the locks immediately, installing a heavy deadbolt, but he knew that symbolic gestures could not stop an organization willing to forge his presence in official records. 2 days later, he was summoned to attend what the letter called an internal arbitration session at the HOA clubhouse. He considered refusing, but a note at the bottom threatened default judgments if he failed to appear. Reluctantly, he walked into the sterile glass building one evening, greeted by the sight of a long conference table surrounded by board members with neatly stacked folders before them. Judy Haynes presided at the head, her tone clipped as she listed his supposed violations. Michael tried to speak, presenting his deed and the opt-out agreement, but each word was drowned beneath citations of bylaws he had never signed. When he raised the issue of forgery, Judy smiled faintly and suggested he was confused about his own records, pointing to their meticulously typed minutes that claimed he had spoken in favor of the reclassification. The others nodded in polite agreement, a theater of consensus that left him feeling as though he had stepped into a world where truth had been inverted and nothing he said mattered. Leaving the clubhouse that night, he felt not only defeated, but invisible, erased in real time by a circle of people who looked him in the eye and told him he had agreed to what he knew he had refused. The darkness outside seemed heavier than usual as he walked to his truck, and for the first time he admitted to himself that he might lose. Not because he was wrong, but because they had the patience, the money, and the machinery to make their version of reality the only one that counted. Yet, the next morning, as he stood on the porch watching mist rise from the lake, a small act rekindled his resolve. A neighbor, Emma Lee, a farmer who lived further up the ridge, stopped by with a basket of eggs. She had heard whispers about the HOA's maneuvers and told him quietly that she had seen men entering his cabin while he was gone. She had even sketched the license plate of a van parked outside, sensing it might be important. Her gesture was not dramatic, but it was human, a reminder that he was not entirely alone, that someone else still recognized his rights. Michael thanked her with genuine relief, tucking the slip of paper into his pocket as though it were a lifeline. Later that day, he traced the plate number through a contact in town and discovered it belonged to a catering company contracted by the HOA, proof that the so-called inventory inside his cabin was part of preparations for the mayor's stay. The discovery did not stop the momentum of their plans, but it gave him something tangible, a thread to pull at in a scheme woven from lies. He copied the information into his growing file of evidence, each page a fragile defense against erasure. The second escalation was no longer subtle harassment or symbolic renaming. It was the active machinery of dispossession grinding into motion, fines, notices, fabricated records, and intrusions stacking against him with the weight of inevitability. As night fell, Michael sat once again at the table by the fire, surrounded by documents, and realized that he had crossed a threshold. He could no longer pretend this was about misunderstanding or miscommunication. It was a siege, calculated and relentless, and he would have to choose whether to stand firm until the end or surrender to the tide that sought to wash his home into someone else's ledger. The thought filled him with dread, but beneath it burned something sharper, the same stubbornness he imagined his uncle had felt in decades past, the refusal to bow to people who mistook bureaucracy for ownership. That refusal, fragile though it felt, was all he had left to hold the line. The mayor's visit was scheduled for a crisp Saturday afternoon, and by the time the morning mist burned off the lake, Michael's cabin looked less like a private refuge and more like a stage set for an event he had never agreed to host. Cars began to arrive along the narrow road, their tires crunching on gravel, and he watched from the window as unfamiliar men and women in coordinated jackets carried coolers, folding tables, and strings of decorative lanterns. They moved with the assurance of people who believed they had a right to be there, ignoring the closed gate and the locks he had installed, as though his resistance were just another obstacle to be cleared away in preparation for a performance. His chest tightened as he realized that if he did nothing, by nightfall the mayor and his family would be eating catered meals in his kitchen and toasting to the generosity of a community that had stolen his home. Rather than wait, Michael walked outside, clutching the folder of evidence he had prepared: the deed, the opt-out agreement, the forged meeting minutes, and the license plate records Emily had helped him gather. He intercepted Judy Haynes at the edge of the porch, where she was directing workers to string lights along the railing. Her eyes flicked to the papers in his hand, and for the first time he saw something beyond her calm detachment. A faint flash of irritation, as though his persistence was an inconvenience she had hoped would fade. He told her firmly that she and her people were trespassing, that the cabin was his private property, and that he had delivered evidence of forgery to the county. She smiled in that clipped way of hers and replied that his concerns had been noted, but that the board had already confirmed the event. "You can either step aside and cooperate," she said coolly, "or you can embarrass yourself in front of the mayor." The words ignited something in him, and for once he did not retreat. He raised his voice, calling across the driveway where the workers stood. He told them the cabin was not community property, that the documents in his hand proved the HOA had lied, and that anyone who entered further without his consent would be trespassing in violation of state law. His voice carried across the clearing, sharper than he had intended, but it had an effect. The workers hesitated, their lanterns swaying in the breeze, their eyes darting between him and Judy. Some muttered uncertainly, while others began to drift back toward their vehicles. Judy's face tightened, but before she could respond, the sound of another engine rolled up the road, and a dark sedan pulled into view. The mayor stepped out with his wife and 2 children, dressed casually, clearly expecting a weekend of leisure. For a moment, Michael felt the world narrow to a single point. Here was the guest for whom his home had been stolen, the symbol of influence the HOA wanted to impress. He walked forward quickly, intercepting them before Judy could begin her polished introductions. With steady breath, he handed the mayor the folder, explaining in plain, urgent words that the HOA had misrepresented his home as a lodge, that signatures and minutes had been falsified, and that his presence today was nothing more than a pawn in a scheme to curry favor. The mayor's expression shifted as he flipped through the documents, his brows furrowing at the signatures and the side notes. His wife looked around uncomfortably, sensing the tension that the brochures had not prepared them for. Judy tried to interject, insisting that Michael was confused and that all records had been properly filed, but the mayor cut her short with a curt gesture. He asked her directly if the signatures were genuine, if Michael had in fact agreed to this arrangement, and for the first time her confidence wavered. She stammered about community consensus and collective approval, but the mayor did not look convinced. He turned back to Michael and said quietly, "If what you're saying is true, then I have been misled." His words carried enough weight that the gathering seemed to collapse. Workers began loading supplies back into vans, the decorative lights left half-strung, the illusion of a festive weekend dissolving under the weight of a single phrase. Judy stood rigid, her jaw tight, but Michael pressed further, telling the mayor that his home had been entered without consent, that inventories had been made, and that threats of foreclosure had been delivered on the basis of forged documents. He handed over the copy of the license plate record from Emma, evidence that catering companies had been contracted under false pretenses. The mayor, clearly uncomfortable now, promised he would have his office review the matter immediately, and, in a gesture that seemed both apologetic and self-preserving, gathered his family back into the sedan and drove away without setting foot inside the cabin. As the vehicles rolled away one by one, silence fell across the clearing. Michael stood on the porch clutching his folder, his heart still racing while Judy lingered a moment longer. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was lower, almost venomous. "You think this is over because you humiliated me in front of him," she said. "But the board doesn't forget." She turned sharply and walked to her SUV, leaving him with the knowledge that though he had stopped this performance, the battle was far from finished. Yet, for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt something like victory. His home remained his, and the illusion the HOA had built had cracked before its most important audience. That night he sat by the fire with the documents spread out before him, exhausted but steadied. The climax had not ended the war, but it had shifted the ground beneath it. He was no longer the solitary man shouting against a machine. He was the owner who had made the mayor himself pause, who had forced the HOA to stumble in their performance of control. It was enough for now to know that their story was no longer seamless, that the cracks were visible, and that he had been heard. The following weeks carried with them a quiet that felt unfamiliar after the storm of intrusion, letters, and staged events. For the first time since the sign declaring his cabin a guest lodge had appeared, Michael could rise in the morning and walk onto the porch without discovering new notices pinned to the posts or strangers unloading supplies in his driveway. The HOA had not vanished, but its confidence had cracked. Judy Haynes no longer appeared at his property, and the workers who once arrived with catering trays and lanterns now kept their distance. What lingered instead was the slow, deliberate machinery of investigation. The mayor's office, unwilling to be tied to a scandal that smelled of corruption, had forwarded Michael's folder to the county, and soon after he was contacted by an inspector who confirmed that the forged signatures and altered meeting minutes would be reviewed by legal counsel. The words were careful, professional, but they carried a weight that reassured him more than any apology could have. In the meantime, Michael returned to the rhythms that had once defined the cabin. He repaired the broken latch on the back door, replaced the curtains in the bedroom, and stacked firewood for the winter. Each task felt like an act of reclamation, a way of reasserting his place in the home that had almost been stolen from him. He kept the brochures, the forged minutes, and the threatening letters in a neat file box, no longer because he feared erasure, but because he knew the record mattered, that truth needed its own archive to resist being rewritten. When Emma stopped by with fresh vegetables from her farm, he thanked her again for her quiet support, and the simple exchange reminded him that, even in a system bent on manipulation, solidarity still had power. One evening, as the sun fell low over the lake and the surface turned gold, he brought out the old wooden sign his uncle had carved decades earlier, the one that read simply, "Harper Cabin." It had been stored in the shed, half forgotten during the chaos, but now he polished the letters and fixed it firmly above the porch. The act felt final, not as a gesture of defiance but as a statement of truth. The cabin was not a lodge, not a stage for politics, not a bargaining chip in the games of a board hungry for influence. It was his home, and it would remain so. As he stood there watching the light fade, the world seemed steadier, the silence no longer threatening but peaceful again, and he knew that while battles with the HOA might continue in different forms, the core of the struggle had been decided. He had drawn the line, and the line had held.